Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with S.Friedman. Thank you for your patience, and we're really glad to be back. So, first of all, we would like to give big thanks to our Stephen Friedman, who's going to give his talk today, and also the U.S. Consulate General here in Almaty, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for joining us weekly. We truly appreciate your comments, feedback, and we'll definitely address the questions today. And feel free to give your comments as well, and we'll address your questions in the next session. Stephen, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aaliyah, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for joining. I also want to thank the American Consulate in Almaty, Elmira, Dana, the entire team, staff that provides this platform for philosophical perspectives on every imaginable topic. And typically, commonly, I try to make a connection between the topic of the talk and international days of celebration, of commemoration, sometimes in terms of some historical event or occasion. Well, today I'm doing something a little broader, more purely philosophical, designing this talk to be in recognition not of a specific day of celebration or commemoration, but of all of them, in the sense that the topic tonight, well, tonight for me, in the daytime for you, is philosophy is freedom. It's actually an aphorism that I wrote just a couple weeks ago, and I thought this would be, I think, a good inspiration and organizing principle for a talk about, well, some of the deepest aspects of philosophy and its resonance throughout the whole range of human experience, human concerns. As I've emphasized, philosophy is, well, we exist in a convergent space. All roads lead to Rome in a convergent space. So it almost doesn't matter what the topic is, where I begin, everything ends up connecting to major philosophical issues and perspectives, the foundation of rigor, the implications of that for whatever problem it is I'm addressing. Well, that's true of this topic as well, though, as I said, this topic has particular resonance, as we'll see with some of the subdivisions of the talk. I wanted to begin by telling a little story. The story concerns an international art event, Art Basel, that's held, I think, annually. It's celebrated in various cities around the world. A few years ago, one of the cities, I'm not sure if it's celebrated or held in Hong Kong every year, but it was a few years ago when an artist, a Korean-American artist, contacted me for help with the project that she was presenting as part of Art Basel that year, the Hong Kong setting for Art Basel. She wanted me to provide some, philosophical couching, framing for the work that she was doing, which was of a conceptual nature. It dealt with body transformation. The ability of 3D printing to create body parts that could, in principle, at least conceptually, allow us to transform our bodies at will and free the prison that the body can sometimes present itself as being, at least to certain individuals from certain points of view. Now, it was a metaphorical project in the sense that 3D printing cannot achieve the duplication of complex molecular biological structures that are at the core of human physiological, neurophysiological functioning. So it was a metaphor, but still, it related to issues of entrapment and freedom and the philosophical perspectives on both of those. So it intersected today's talk and my major philosophical concerns. On the actual occasion of the display of her work from Hong Kong, she arranged for a panel discussion in Los Angeles. I remained in Los Angeles. And the panel discussion was to be about her work. It was not structured in the sense that she invited any type of comments, perspectives, so I wasn't constrained in any way. There were two other members of the panel. One was a graduate student at UCLA. The other was a woman who was writing, philosophy, I think from sociological, political perspectives. Prior to the talk, or prior to the panel discussion, I was sitting in the room where it was being held with this graduate student. And we were talking about random topics in philosophy, and somehow or other, we ended up talking about the work of Freud. And I was telling him about Wittgenstein's intervention in terms of providing a more critical assessment of Freud's work in the 1930s that led to its being more rigorously tested and ultimately not fully embraced, no longer embraced, at least in medical schools. When I was in medical school, when I was doing psychiatry, Freud never came up, not once. It was partly because his work, his psychotherapeutics, failed clinical testing. Two groups of individuals with various types of neuroses were given either no intervention, no treatment, or Freudian psychoanalytic intervention. And at the end of some period of study, it was found that people in the experimental group got better at the same rate as people in the control group, which meant that it wasn't clear that Freud's work was providing any decisive clinical benefit, not one that could be established. Wittgenstein's work took a much more philosophical approach to Freud. He challenged Freud's claims to having been doing science. Wittgenstein maintained that Freud was actually doing a form of pre-science. That a lot of his results could not even in principle be tested. His notions, for example, of dream interpretations didn't provide any real criteria for assessing whether a dream interpretation was correct or not. And this relates to an issue that I've gone to repeatedly, the idea that we can't step outside the world, see what a dream really means, and then step back in and see if Freudian psychoanalytic doctrine captures that meaning. But Wittgenstein went further and argued that Freud was elaborating a mythology, something that could not ultimately be tested, could not be grounded in a rigorous scientific investigation or set of results. Of course, based on my work, we know that science itself cannot be grounded in rigorous controlled experimentation. So science itself has what we could call a mythological status, not that it's of no value, but that it can't be rigorously grounded, rigorously established in the way that philosophical results demand of themselves that they be so formulated and grounded. So, and I was talking about how Wittgenstein felt that people could be trapped within a mythology, and the value of critical philosophical analysis, the value of rigorous analysis, was to free individuals from those mythologies. One could adopt them just as we adopt scientific results for various heuristic purposes, because they can help us achieve a given result. They can help us achieve maybe a therapeutic result. Maybe they can achieve the building of a better bridge, the design of a better television set or rocket or communication network. But in terms of rigorously grounded results, that's the domain of philosophy per se, and only philosophy. Well, I think this graduate student was sympathetic to Freud, and he said, well, but Wittgenstein, he was an ordinary language philosopher. What kind of perspective could Wittgenstein provide on Freud, on a psychoanalyst, on a psychologist? Well, this is a problem in contemporary philosophy, the failure to come to terms with the work of, well, Wittgenstein in particular, a figure of Wittgenstein's magnitude and depth of insight that relates to the nature of concepts themselves, all concepts, and so applies to any type of field or undertaking. Anything that's formulated in language, intersects the work and is illuminated and clarified by the work of Wittgenstein. So, it's not clear to me that this particular graduate student would really be capable of doing significantly fruitful work, not having had that type of philosophical training and exposure to a more rigorous coming to terms with the nature of language, the nature of concepts, the nature of Wittgenstein's results. It's as if someone were doing physics and not being privy to the results, the insights of Einstein or Heisenberg. It doesn't lead. It can, one can generate a career, but one can't really contribute significantly unless one has assimilated these major milestones within philosophical tradition, as Wittgenstein represents. But what was especially interesting and germane for today's talk is that I started to ask him about what he was doing as a graduate student, what his PhD dissertation was on, what was his thesis, and it turned out he was investigating the nature of freedom. Now, he was probably investigating it from a somewhat political perspective, but again, without the benefit of access to rigorous results, one can't achieve the kind of definitive and illuminating insights into the nature of freedom, philosophic freedom, freedom that matters decisively. So, yes, it's not easy to come to terms with the work of certain philosophers. It's not easy to come to terms with the work of Kierkegaard. Not easy to come to terms with the work of Kant. It might be maintained that, unless you're actively doing philosophy and find that your results intersect some of the results of those individuals, you never quite have a true appreciation or understanding of what they've achieved. But it's been a particular problem in the case of Wittgenstein's work, partly because of its subtlety, partly because it demands a fairly thorough assimilation of the philosophical problems that Wittgenstein's work was addressing. Problems about the nature of concepts, the nature of language, that allows him to provide deep insights into the strengths and limitations of the work of someone like Freud, and provides a means of freeing us from the mythologies that such work can advance. Unwittingly, unknowingly, Freud wasn't aware of that. So, okay, now, the issue of freedom in a political context, for me, first of all, is not the topic of today's talk, but it does, and I should make some comments about it. When I think of freedom in a political social context, what immediately comes to mind is the 18th century Swiss-French philosophe Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose work, The Social Contract, was seminal in leading to the ideas, the thinking that motivated the French Revolution. Not the American Revolution so much. The American Revolution was more motivated by the writings of John Locke, but similar ideas about government existing for the benefit of the citizens that were voluntarily, in principle, undertaking a contract, so that in exchange for giving up certain freedoms, certain liberties within a social system, one received certain benefits of protection, benefits of societal coordination, laws that one could agree to follow, because following those laws would help reduce tensions and conflict within the social system and allow for greater happiness, ultimately. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's work, The Social Contract, begins famously with the line, "Man was born free, but he is everywhere in chains." Now, today we would say that humanity is born free, but it is everywhere in chains. The kind of situation that Rousseau was dealing with was society, the nature of governance in society. And what do we know about society? Well, it's a convergent system, right? We have individuals coming together. We have individuals cohering. It is a heuristic structure. Since we have individuals coming together in a system that represents a convergent space, the issue becomes how to maintain some degree of integrity, of individual freedom and dignity compatible with that convergent structure. Convergence in general is constraining. In fact, I have in some of these polls painted two aphorisms that go directly to the point. Heuristics converge to constrain. Epistemics diverge to transcend. The nature of philosophic space is a divergent space. We are not in principle constrained. We are within epistemic space distinguished by our distinctiveness. It's a space, again, where things are not brought together, but are, again, demarked, distinguished. That's the basis of human dignity. It's ultimately the basis of philosophic freedom, the kind of freedom that, for example, Buddhism sought, freedom from concepts themselves. And a few weeks ago, I was reading some passages from the Heart Sutra, which talks about there being no suffering, no extinction of suffering, no birth, no death. Well, how is that type of formulation even possible? Well, within Buddhism, it's possible because Buddhism sought and thought it had found a way to extinguish concepts. Well, the way one extinguishes concepts is to embrace epistemic space, which again can be shown in this form, right? Epistemic space. All points are distinguishable. Heuristic space, conceptual space. Things are grouped together. Chairs. We have things are grouped together based upon approximate similarities, based upon, again, any two things are approximately the same for some purpose or other within societal space, linguistic space, heuristic space. Things are rigorously distinct within epistemic space. Remember, rigor is of difference. Wittgenstein wanted to begin his great work, The Philosophical Investigations, with that quotation from King Lear, Shakespeare's King Lear, "All teach you differences." He didn't because his work hadn't quite distilled itself to that point where he, I think, could embrace rigor as the limit of difference and philosophy as embracing the limit of rigor. But he was very close. Okay. So we're not talking about freedom within a social context. We are talking about, well, there's a term in ballet, absoluta. A great ballerina will be called a prima ballerina. The greatest of ballerinas is a prima ballerina absoluta, the highest possible level. Well, the kind of freedom that we're talking about philosophically is freedom absoluta, the highest possible embodiment of freedom, again, at the limit of rigor, where all constraints cease in the way that all constraints, all conceptualizations cease within the formulation of the Heart Sutra, within Buddhist nirvana, within mystical union with God. Those are metaphors. Remember, whenever I use religious terminology, salvation or enlightenment, I'm using them metaphorically. I am stipulating philosophically that rigor achieves what religions have aspired to, but achieves it not based upon a set of beliefs, not based upon faith, not based upon a provisional relationship to, a deity, based upon a strict and exacting understanding and appreciation of the nature of existence itself, that we exist in difference from everything else. And that does not permit the clustering that conceptualization involves, that helps us survive, doesn't save us. Again, to use religious terminology. That, again, I'm using metaphorically. Philosophically, we're dealing with extremes. We're dealing with an extreme conception of freedom. We are dealing with an extreme solution. And that's one of the reasons why philosophy is often seen to intersect certain religious types of concerns. I mentioned, I think, a few weeks ago that science and religion are closer to each other in their nature than philosophy is to either one. That's why we say we might believe in a religion or in certain religious ideas, doctrines, dogmas. We are said to believe in certain results of science. We do not believe in philosophical results, not in their pure distilled form. We do not believe in rigor. We have no choice. That's the one thing about which we have no choice. Philosophy frees us from everything as long as we embrace the simple demand of rigor, which is there not to imprison us, but ultimately to free us from everything else. That's its power. And it's a supreme power, and it is a greater power than anything else possesses by definition. the limit of rigor is such. Okay. One of the types of freedoms that one encounters religiously and so philosophically, and in certain political contexts, the American president Franklin Roosevelt made an issue of this: freedom from fear. We have in the Bhagavad Gita, the Song of God of the Hindu tradition, an encounter between Krishna, an avatar, right, an embodiment of Vishnu, the supreme deity, and Arjuna, a warrior who is hesitating on the eve of battle. He's afraid. Life is fearsome, often, typically, right? Remember, I've quoted a lot Emerson, great nations, great spirits are not boasters or buffoons, but perceivers of the terror of life. Well, philosophy is here to undercut that terror, but again, at the limit of rigorous representation. So, in the Bhagavad Gita, in trying to calm Arjuna, give him courage, Krishna says, realize that pleasure and pain, gain and loss, victory and defeat are all one and the same. Then go into battle. It's a little bit similar to that joke that I've referenced before, that Thales would tell people. Thales was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. Pre-Socratic, he came before Socrates, before the start in earnest of the Western philosophical tradition, which is an epistemological tradition fundamentally, right? Addressing the nature of knowledge, how we know what we claim to know. Thales would say to people, life is no different than death. People would say to him, then why don't you die? And he would respond, because it makes no difference. Okay. Well, and I've mentioned that was in fact the attitude adopted by Michelangelo, that this world was beautiful. He expected the next world to be as beautiful, to be equally so. It was created by the hand of the same deity. This is Michelangelo's thinking, his faith. Well, from a philosophical perspective, how do you know? Right? We don't know. We don't make those kinds of identities. Those identifications are characteristic of convergent processes, heuristic processes. They can make us feel better, and we might embrace them because they do make us feel better, but they don't have a rigorous foundation. Rigor is of distinction, difference. And so, remember the Socratic response to that issue of life and death and quieting our fear, freeing us from our fear, when he says to his friends at the end of Plato's Apology, after having been condemned to death by the Athenian court. And I've referenced this a number of times. It's one of my favorite things in the history of philosophy because it represents the beginning, in earnest, of the Western philosophical tradition. Socrates says, and so we go our separate ways, you to live and I to die, and which is better, only God knows. What frees us from fear, fear of death, is the recognition that we do not know. We presume. We suffer that we presume more than we know to the end of time. And notice how the Western philosophical tradition begins in earnest by confronting the most significant of all issues, life and death, the fear of death. In the same way that Christianity addresses torture to death at the outset. It doesn't shirk from that. Socrates doesn't shirk from the most fundamental of all issues. In the same way that Confucius didn't shirk from it. He was asked about death, about should we fear it? And his response was, one world at a time. We focus upon what we know, here and now. Everything else is presumptive. Again, we presume more than we know, as if there were no time. And one aphorism that I've referred to that sort of encapsulates that: we suffer not because of what we know, and not because what we do not know, and not because what we cannot know, but because what we think we know, unjustifiably. It's a matter of freedom, freedom from presumption, freedom. We suffer our beliefs to the end of time. There's a point in Phalaris's Bull, that play that I did a few years back, where I talk about the issue of death, and my the way I put it in the play is: if someone dies, what do you know? That they will not return to the end of all time? How do you know that exactly? The point is, you don't. But you live and breathe and suffer as if you did know just such a thing. In every direction of our pain, of our suffering, there is some set of beliefs, presuppositions, presumptions that rigor can eliminate, rigor can extirpate, can free us from. That, and again, we can have confidence in it because, again, by definition, there is nothing stronger. If there's something stronger than rigor, then that's the greater rigor that we embrace. I have an aphorism that appeared in an art show of mine where there was a book of aphorisms on the walls of the gallery space. The interior of the gallery space had poles of mine suspended from the ceiling. One of the aphorisms that I thought would be controversial, I thought everybody would take exception to it, was: the Bible is not the word of God. The word of God is stronger. And surprisingly, people came up to me and said, yes, of course, yes, absolutely. We want it to be stronger. It is. Rigor is at that level of power and strength to free us in every direction from every possible constraint. That's its power and its nature. There's a line from Gandhi that I like to quote a lot. God cannot appear where there is hate or shame or fear. Well, again, philosophy, rigor has that power, and it's significant. And I've told this anecdote, and it's an important anecdote because it relates to the very beginning of my recognition of the relation between my philosophical results of rigor itself and human concerns. When I first started writing philosophy, I was just interested in elaborating propositions that were incontestable, right? Past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. But the power of those propositions over human concerns, well, it wasn't an essential feature of those propositions. The propositions had to stand or fall based upon their satisfying internal demands of rigor. I've stressed that for psychology, for psychotherapy, it's important that people's emotional stresses be alleviated, be eased. Philosophy, in its purity, in the beauty of its purity, has no fundamental interest in any results outside of itself. It's not here, it doesn't exist to build better bridges. It doesn't exist to make us happy. It has the power to make us happy precisely because that is not its interest at all. Its interest is in elaborating what is incontrovertible. And that has the power to overcome any sources of human misery, pain, suffering. And I first got a glimpse of that with an early aphorism of mine, selflessness, how one acts not out of need, which I found was able to eliminate my acrophobia, my fear of heights. I experienced fear of heights looking up at tall buildings. One day I was looking up at some tall buildings near where I lived. I was feeling queasy. I was feeling acrophobia. I had just written that aphorism. I decided just as an experiment to run it through my mind and see what the result might be. And as soon as I ran it through my mind, the acrophobia, all of the physical, all of the psychological stress associated with it just vanished like a switch. Selflessness, how one acts not out of need, because it turns out that fears, acrophobia is a fear, fears are grounded in a sense of need, what we fundamentally think we need, deeply, profoundly require. Well, if, as Socrates put forth, we don't know whether life is superior to death, that is a presumption, then what exactly are our needs? That aphorism, selflessness, how one acts not out of need, goes to the core of that issue. It was able to evaporate every fear that I experienced subsequently just because it was able to undercut the sense of need that the fear was grounded in. We have a fear of heights because we feel that, well, that we're vulnerable, right? If we're on a tall height, an elevation, we can fall, we can die. But again, where does Western philosophy begin? With the contention that you only presume life to be greater than death. It's a presumption against all future time, beyond what you can possibly know. As Confucius emphasized, one world at a time. And the world, the reality that rigor puts us face to face with is that epistemic reality of distinctiveness where concepts cannot arise, because concepts are based upon approximate similarities, what Wittgenstein called family resemblances between things that are similar for some purpose. Like here, I prepared a new page. This one had some stains on it, some wrinkles over time, so I thought I'd prepare a new one. Now, in a sense, they're identical, right? In what sense are they identical? They're identical in that they serve the same purpose within heuristic space. They communicate the same types of ideas, but beyond that, existentially, they're distinct. And from the standpoint of rigor, it's that existential distinction that matters. We exist based on that existential distinction. Our dignity is grounded in that existential distinction, and religious salvation is achieved rigorously through that epistemic distinction. Now, a lot of our suffering, our sense of constraint, our sense of limitation, our sense of being entrapped by circumstance is grounded, as I've said, in presumption, what we presume to know. A lot of the process of philosophy is subtractive, removing things. Mozart famously commented that in music, what matters most of all, what is most important, are the silences. It's almost a mystical type of formulation, but it has bearing, that comment, in philosophy. When we look at the work of Socrates, it's deeply negative, much of it, right? He would confront people and demonstrate for them that what they thought they knew, they could not legitimately justify, that they did not know what they claimed to know. And ultimately, I don't know that Socrates always made this leap, but they suffered because of those claims. When AlGizaldi, the great Islamic philosopher of the 12th century, considered within the Islamic tradition at the rank of Saint Augustine, the great Christian theologian of the 4th century. AlGizaldi wrote a work called Deliverance from Error. And in that work, he undertakes a process of systematic doubt, doubting everything that he had come to believe, because he wants to get to a foundation of, well, what I will now call, right, what I express as rigor. Now, AlGizaldi wasn't using this terminology, these formulations, but that was behind the enterprise. We believe lots of things. We think we know lots of things. Let's clear the field, clear the ground, and reconstruct our knowledge of the world based on firm foundations. Now, what's really interesting historically, in terms of the intellectual history of the human race, is that a few hundred years later, Descartes undertook the identical process. I mean, identical heuristically, right? In Descartes' meditations on first philosophy, he first begins with systematically doubting everything. So again, he could achieve some firm foundation of knowledge. For Descartes, it ends in the proposition, I think, therefore I am. But he undertakes a process that, as it is elaborated, in his work, is so similar to what AlGizaldi did that it's hard to imagine that Descartes wasn't familiar in some form or other with AlGizaldi's writing. I don't know. I mean, it's, every now and then there are these convergences, right? These developments of ideas that are independent of each other but achieve the same result, the same formulation. But when I read AlGizaldi, I was astonished at the similarity to Descartes, whom I had read earlier. And it seemed to me almost inconceivable that Descartes had not been influenced in some form, had not had some exposure. But again, it's a subtractive process. When you read Wittgenstein, it feels like there's a lot of negativity, a lot of things that you thought you knew, you are finding, through Wittgenstein's work, that you cannot claim to know. And Wittgenstein at one point wrote that it may seem on some superficial encounter, some superficial glance, that we're destroying, Wittgenstein. I'm destroying, philosophy is destroying everything valuable, everything of genuine interest. And Wittgenstein goes on, no, we're just destroying houses of cards. And for Wittgenstein, clearing up the ground of language on which they stand. But again, searching for that firm, incontrovertible foundation that I articulate in terms of what? Epistemic space, a divergent space, a space in which there is no internal identity. A is not equal to A, the fundamental condition of logic that pertains in heuristic space, a non-symmetry space, a space in which everything is radically distinct from everything else, and so ultimately an aconceptual space, the type of space that Buddhism sought. Buddhism sought to achieve that aconceptual representation through an analysis of the concept of persistence and change, and the relationship of those concepts to a deeper sense of what's genuinely real. Now, I've analyzed that in other talks, and I've explained how one of the propositions that's central, at least to the early formulation of Buddhism, that nothing lasts, is a belief. It's not something that we can know. We can only know it from outside the world. We can't leave the world to know such a thing. So it's not a philosophical proposition, not a rigorous proposition. And so Buddhism still is within the category of a religion, even though its formulations and results can be understood and given greater power, force, through a rigorous representation of those results, which is one of the things you could see my work as doing. In fact, I've said to people, my work is, my philosophical work is not really in conflict with any of these great religious traditions. For example, it can be seen as clarifying, as providing them with a rigorous foundation for what they otherwise believe. So, philosophy is not in conflict with religious aspiration. But again, philosophy only uses religious terms metaphorically to help promote understanding. When I elaborate that aphorism, for example, Eden is a landscape of philosophical rigor that I was asked a question about, and I talked about a little bit. I'm using Eden metaphorically, right, as a condition of a complete solution to all the problems of human life, which philosophically arise because of certain presumptions, certain claims we cannot legitimately make, but that we nevertheless embrace, that rigor frees us from. Hume is an important figure in this type of before I get to you, I should show you some photographs. I'm always forgetting to do this. I'm always downloading photographs, images, paintings. Just Freud. Rousseau, the Swiss-French philosophe, 18th century philosopher, author of Social Contract. Gandhi, God cannot appear where there is hate or shame or fear. Remember, Gandhi is now seen by many Hindus as an avatar of Vishnu, as an equivalent of Krishna. A scene from the Bhagavad Gita where Vishnu has appeared in the form of Arjuna. Vishnu has appeared in the form of Krishna, the standing figure, and Arjuna is the warrior that's receiving counsel from him. Here's AlGizaldi, the great Islamic theologian thinker. Here is a copy of the book, Deliverance from Error. Yes. And after that, we have an image of Descartes that I wanted to show. I'll just show it. Here's Descartes. Now, one of the figures who, not from a philosophical, but more of a religious, a mystical perspective, engaged in this subtractive process, that's Descartes, René Descartes, who engaged in the same kind of universal doubt to achieve a firm foundation, a rigorous foundation. Again, he didn't quite achieve that, but philosophy makes progress. And we've sort of progressed to the point where one can articulate the conditions of rigor that do free us broadly, deeply, universally. Let's go back here a second. Okay, so Meister Eckhart, I've mentioned before. There's Meister Eckhart, there's a painting. He was a medieval Christian mystic who said, well, one of the things I've quoted from him is in relation to a sermon called Meister Eckhart's Daughter. I am a something among some things, and so I go. It's a formulation very similar to what one sees in the Heart Sutra of Buddhism, where there's a deconceptualization taking place. A deconceptualization that's grounded more in various modes of belief, not rigorous formulation, but the result is what, again, rigor achieves, that freedom from conceptualizations that are limiting. And that's, in fact, what is happening in that sermon, Meister Eckhart's Daughter, where this girl who visits his monastery says she's not a woman, not a girl, not a servant, not any of the things that people might designate her by, because each one of those has specific inherent limitations that her genuine circumstance cannot assume, is not limited by. She is a something among some things. And again, that's a state of deconceptualization, of the disappearance of concepts that's achieved for Meister Eckhart with mystical union with God, where, again, it's the point of this HCE, when at the limit of heuristic convergence, when all things become one thing, all distinctions vanish, which means all concepts disappear. So a state of universal convergence turns out to be equivalent in terms of its deconceptualized nature, representation, to a state of radical divergence, where concepts do not form in the first instance. It's the way to sort of appreciate this notion of universal convergence that's imagined in mystical union with God, where one becomes one with God, is to imagine your room, your environment, your world, all becoming a single tone of a single color, so that you don't see any distinctions. Objects then would vanish. That's how, at the limit of heuristic convergence, objects vanish. Therefore, you achieve a comparable state of deconceptualization to what epistemic space rigorously achieves. Well, okay, we're doing okay, I think, sort of, not really, in terms of time. I want to say a few things about Hume. Hume was an 18th century philosopher known as a radical skeptic. Again, someone who is denying that we know a majority of the things that we claim to know, which, again, is seen as often a problematic state, except when its relationship to the nature of rigor and the nature of the freedom that rigor achieves is understood. There was about 20 years ago, there was a magazine that was starting to be published in the Midwest of the United States. And they were going to have a celebrity interview. And I had just done this skywriting in New York that I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And they wanted to interview me as the celebrity interview. Obviously, I was not at that level, but the editor of the magazine thought that, you know, the skywriting and some of the things she'd read about it was compelling. So, and she ended up writing up this interview that was featured in the magazine. I have well, it's hard to see here, but there's one page of it, and there's another page of it. It was a long interview, but Notice the title. S.Friedman, his philosophy could end world suffering. So she had an intimation of what I was talking about philosophically in terms of the power of rigor. But the reason I bring this up now is that I quoted to her an aphorism that she printed and she featured in the article. And the aphorism, it's hard, I'll just tell it to you, it's hard to read it by showing it. Well, I don't know, you might be able to see it, but the limit, there it is, the limit of philosophical skepticism is religious salvation. It's another way of saying what I'm saying here in terms of what rigor achieves. And one of the people moving in that direction historically was David Hume, the philosopher who challenged our notions of causality, of cause and effect, challenged the logic that led us to think that the past could predict the future in some rigorous sense. Now, the fact that it can't is what I summarize in that aphorism that I've said repeatedly. The past cannot guarantee the future rigorously. It hasn't happened yet. What hasn't happened yet cannot be rigorously known to take a certain form except from outside the world, and we can't leave the world to see that, appreciate that. It's a fantasy, a fatal fantasy. And then the future decides the past. What happens next decides our sense of the reality. David Hume was the first person really to explore the limits of our ability to project cause and effect rigorously into our experience. There's I don't have time to go into him in the kind of detail that he deserves. I've referenced him as the greatest philosopher to write in English. But there's a section, a paragraph, a verse in the books of Joshua that deals with this issue of induction, of the logic that leads us to think that we can know the future effectively. And it goes, induction became a recurring concern. How we can know the future, how we can ever learn, and how we can escape the imaginings of fate, what to know and what to sow, what we can assume, and every mode of exit from a cloistered room, the tragic vision of the world and certainty of doom, and the climate and the soil that Eden needs to bloom. That climate and that soil that supports Eden is the climate and the soil of philosophical rigor that does not allow presumption, does not allow the conceptualizations that, again, limit us, imprison us, ultimately. The mythologies that entrapped Freud, that philosophy, that Wittgenstein's analysis can free us from, that rigor can free us from. Even science itself, it's a heuristic, it's something we can use to achieve certain ends that are in our interest, that we think are in our interest, greater technologies. But as we use it, it's important that we recognize it is not operating at the level of rigor, and so we need never be used by it, never be imprisoned by a scientific result. It's vital to the understanding of the nature of the scientific enterprise. And only philosophy can bring us that perspective, that understanding, because only philosophy is operating at a higher level of rigor. So it can critique the limitations of science, even as it recognizes its value, its usefulness. This notion of not being constrained by the past is something that Sartre, the 20th century existentialist philosopher, famously commented upon. He wrote that the French people were most free during the occupation, the German occupation, because he said, They were free of the past. And in what forms does the past ensnare us, entrap us, to limit our freedoms? In the forms of expectation. We are, again, constrained by our expectations. But the logic of tautology, and I think next week there's an international day devoted to laughter. And I might, I've discussed humor in the past. I might give a talk more specifically on laughter and its philosophical significance. There's a saying in the Buddhist tradition that laughter precedes enlightenment. It signifies a certain freedom, a liberation, ultimately a liberation from expectation. There is at the core of our logic, our logical systems, something called tautology. A tautology is actually form A equals A. You get it within epistemic space, it's A is not equal to A. It's something that is incontestably true, logically true. Well, what's interesting about tautologies is that they're used to express the deepest wisdom. A man is a man. It is what it is. We hear it all the time, some form or other. It's been said that the essence of King Lear, one of Shakespeare's greatest works, if not his greatest work, is the idea, the understanding that Lear achieves, the king who thought of himself as superior, to humanity because he was a king. What he achieves when everything is stripped from him is a recognition that his fundamental dignity is his basic humanity. He discovers at the end of the play, a man is a man. Well, that represents the highest wisdom. The question is, how does something that seemed to have no content, a man is a man, well, of course a man is a man. How does that communicate something of deep significance in terms of wisdom, and what is its role, at the foundation of our logic? Well, it turns out the way a tautology means a man is a man is only understandable by slowing it down and seeing what we are actually anticipating within the formulation that the formulation then denies. For example, a man is. When I say that, you're expecting me to say something that characterizes a man. A man is, tall, strong, a warrior, an heir, here, near, over there. I'm using some lines from the books of Joshua. When we say a man is, so we're expecting a proposition of that sort that will communicate something about men generally, a man in particular, but when we hear a man is a man, it denies the expectation of what we call the predication. A tautology, the power of the tautology, means by the denial of that expectation. In the same way that humor communicates by denying the expectation that the setup of the joke leads us to anticipate. We are freed from the expectation in the same way as the tautology is freeing us from an expectation. And that ultimately is how it is meaning deeply and significantly. There's a section at the end of the books of Joshua that deals with that. In fact, maybe I'll recite it. I think I have a little time. I'm going to run out of time, as always, but I want to get to our questions from last time, and I promise I will. Okay, so just want to make sure A man is a man, as everyone knows. But what deeper truths do tautologies disclose? With Cordelia dead, and through tears that burn, Lear will discern, as best he can, that a man is a man. And this will have taken a lifetime to learn. But we have not yet seen how tautologies mean. Let's study an ocean in slow motion. A man is what? Tall, strong, a warrior, an heir, here, near, over there. As Eckhart's daughter, we can only stare and answer a man against expectation of predication, common or rare. It means as humor, by thwarting what we expect, denying our sense of what must come next. And knowledge is a demonstration of just such expectation, and its walls confine as prevarication. But rigor demurs, finding reason to doubt what we think must come about, as the past is a prison, and this the way out. We wallpaper the future with prints from the past and marvel that pain can last and last, as if guesswork were gain and rigor too plain, as if two things could ever be the same. But that they cannot is what we forgot in journeying far from Eden. That Eden, that is a landscape of philosophical rigor. About 20 years ago, I did skywriting in New York, highly concentrated, even more concentrated than my aphorisms tended to be. The skywriting looked, let's see. Here's David Hume. There is Sartre. Here's the skywriting. You can see some images of it. What was skywritten above Central Park in New York 20 years ago. 3 aphorisms. God plays dice in Eden. Presume and suffer. The future is freedom. Right? Because the future is unconstrained. The future is what is an avenue, a basis for the kind of deconceptualization that epistemic space sort of rigorously achieves. I liked early on to deal with issues of the logic of time. Time's logic, not passage, heals. But now I tend to deal more with kind of mathematical formulations, just because they allow for an even more concise representation, and one that has the power of logical mathematical formulation. It's highly distilled. Okay, I want to talk quickly. John Berryman is an American 20th century literary critic and poet that wrote a book called The Freedom of the Poet. And in this book, there is an essay, it's a collection of essays, on Don Quixote. And the title of the essay is The Freedom of the Dawn of Don Quixote. And I want to read you a little excerpt from this story just to give you another sort of direction that philosophy provides sort of a liberation from. Where are my glasses? It goes like this. John Berryman is actually one of the important influences on my style of writing, not just philosophy, but he himself has an aphoristic form of expression, even though he's not writing aphorisms per se, but they're close. Okay, so I just want to read you this quickly from that essay. He's considering the subject of Don Quixote. He says, quest, let's call the subject. It was Hamlet's also, and Oedipus's, and King Lear's, for freedom from the responsibilities of power, and Dante's in the Commedia, the Divine Comedy. What is the quest for? Here, we may pause to ask whether it matters what the quest is for. It is a very odd thing that, as of great works of art, it does not seem to signify what the subject or purpose is. Judaizing, Galatians, chivalric nonsense, the author's power of mind, intensity of feeling, greatness of spirit, breadth of experience, depth of imagination make or not the work. It does not seem to matter. But here it matters. For the subject, for the object of this quest is freedom. And this is the topic not only of the Epistle to the Galatians and the controversy between Luther and Erasmus, which Luther won because he made Erasmus look like a window shopper in the previous century, but of all art of which I have any knowledge. What's the relation between art and freedom? Art deals with transformation. It takes colors and transforms them into an object that the original colors did not seem like they would necessarily have the capacity to express or represent. The idea that it can make a wall into a window onto a different reality. So it's capable of profound transformation, which means it can free us from a presumptive sense of circumstance. So it's serving a similar purpose to philosophy. But again, for me, philosophy achieves it most strongly, most definitively, most liberatingly in its ground and evocation and elaboration of rigor and its implications in every direction. There's a comment that the Dalai Lama likes. I've heard him say this a number of times when he's asked to summarize his thought, his Buddhist perspective. And he says, calm the mind. Rigor calms the mind. It ends discussion. It ends whatever process we feel we are imprisoned in or trapped by or adherent to. It frees us from anything because it is the greater power. Let me close with a section from Phalaris's bull that addresses these issues, puts them in some unified context. To like only one song is not to like music. The solution to the world is our singular song. And so what do we do to experience the solution to the world? Realize that, actually, I better read this because I don't want to make a mistake. First, realize that the future, not the past, decides the reality. And so everything is still possible. Second, where you stand, no one has ever stood before. So what has applied to anyone need no longer apply. Every concept, including death, mortality. This is the epistemic. that each of us is the irreducible center of the world. It is the point of Einstein's physics. We exist in a place of dignity, indifference from everything else, the incontestable point of salvation, of freedom. But again, it is a freedom grounded in philosophical rigor. Okay, I have some questions from last time. Let me turn to them right now. I wanted to leave a little bit more time than I usually do, and I think I've succeeded. Okay. Now, as often, these questions are broad, and each one could be the topic of a talk. So I'm going to give clearly abbreviated answers. What do you think would be the main difference of US philosophy? Okay, well, again, the United States is a very diverse culture, thousands of universities, lots of departments of philosophy. It's more divergent than convergent, as a culture. But what was dominant when I was doing philosophy at Harvard, and I think it's a dominant part of this tradition, is, again, an embrace of rigor, an embrace of, again, not to the degree that I'm elaborating it, but an embrace of a precision and a respect for logical, even mathematical dimensions of representation, an embrace of the epistemological tradition, a careful analysis and attention to how we know what we claim to know, an embrace of figures like, well, Quine at Harvard was a mathematical logician, an embrace of Wittgenstein, an embrace of John Austin, someone, people that are engaged in the careful analysis of language, the precise analysis of what we are saying, of the nature of the concepts that we are used to say it. So there is a precision, a rigor that is demanded of the philosophical enterprise. Now, at the same time, when I was at Harvard, there was a separation between that tradition, that epistemological tradition, and what was more characteristic of continental European philosophy, existentialism, and its progeny, its offspring, going back to Kierkegaard. I remember I was once in a little group discussion with Quine, again, the great mathematical logician at Harvard. And someone asked him about a work, I think a work that had recently been published, or a popular work on existentialist philosophy, The Irrational Man. And Quine was dismissive. He was like, he said he looked at it and he couldn't make sense of it. Didn't rise to that level of technical demand that he imposed upon his philosophical researches, investigations. For me, I've always been interested in the broader aspirations of continental philosophy in terms of like a Kierkegaard's effort at achieving a broad and deep solution to human life that rises to a level of religious intensity, but to do so within the context of the epistemological rigor of the Anglo-American tradition, or the more recent Anglo-American common language, ordinary language tradition. So for me, it's that convergence that is central. But the most important aspect of American philosophy that I think is the enduring aspect is its embrace of, well, again, let's call it rigor, an attempt to achieve rigorous formulations. Now, that's not universal. There are articles that I've read where people give up on that and say, let's be content with something less ambitious. And my feeling is they haven't pursued rigor to its limits as I've attempted to do in my work, so they don't recognize that what they are otherwise trying to achieve at a lower level of rigor is in fact achieved at its limit. Okay, another question. What are the main modern philosophical questions or issues of the USA? There's a lot. One is what I just mentioned to you about trying to operate at a lower level of rigor. I reject that. There's a lot of influence, a lot of emphasis upon philosophy related to social issues, questions of freedom, questions of dignity, questions of gender. Again, for me, those issues are best and most forcefully and most significantly addressed within the framework that I'm providing in terms of whether something is rigorous, epistemic, whether it is heuristic, and so serving some purpose, but otherwise fundamentally arbitrary to some societal end. Philosophical investigations into the nature of dignity is something that, for me, is just an investigation into the fundamental nature of epistemic space, where we are distinctive and distinguished from everyone, everything else, and so are irreplaceable. And so our dignity is unchallengeable. And finally, I know I'm doing this very quickly. I'm sorry, I apologize. What is the main interpretation of philosophy through classical books? Okay, a lot of philosophy traditionally arises from very simple questions that people ask that have a very simple form. What is whatever we're considering? What is truth? What is beauty? What is existence? What is an object? What is a word? What is a proposition? What is just action? What is a good action? What is the nature of the good? What is good? Now, these questions go through an epistemological sort of sieve, filter, beginning with Socrates, where the investigation is often historically in terms of, again, how we know what we think we know. That's been probably the most important historical trend of Western philosophy. Then in more recent, the last 100 years or so, there's been an emphasis upon the nature of language, because all of these questions, philosophical questions, are expressed in linguistic terms. And so if we're interested in investigating the nature of knowledge, well, we should be investigating perhaps the nature of the concept of knowledge, the word knowledge. And that's central to the work of Wittgenstein and other ordinary language philosophers. And they provide enormous insight, enormous illumination, that is not provided by a dictionary. These represent deeper investigations into how concepts are used, that the meaning of a word, the meaning of a concept is its use, its role within the culture, within the society. And that has been a powerful tool of contemporary philosophy. I was trained partly in that tradition, but also partly in the continental existential tradition that, again, I thought was poorly understood even by its elaborators. When it's only as a result of my investigation into the nature of rigor that I think I can distill the existential tradition into the recognition that we cannot view the world from the outside, even though that is a linguistic impulse of ours. Okay, I know that is a quick run through of those questions. I hope that provided some sense of my my take on them. And again, if I haven't answered them satisfactorily and you want to ask for some further clarification, just feel free and I'll address them next time or subsequently.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for such an amazing talk as always, and thank you for dedicating your time for the questions. Dear audience, we see everything, and now I would like still to announce a few comments and the questions. From Yerkan. Hello, Professor Stephen Friedman. We're really glad to see you again.
Very glad to see you. I'm so glad that you continue to participate in these talks. I very much appreciate it.
Thanks a lot for interesting lectures. Thank you for joining. Then the question from Yerkan, how do you think, probably what do you think about the perspective of profession of human resources management?
Okay.
Then what kind of philosophical questions of human resource issues are actual? And then the role of human resources in developing international relationships and salvation of global problems, for example, the US and Kazakhstan. Very good, very good. So yeah, thank you very much for the questions. We will definitely address them in the end of the next session. Thank you very much, Stephen, for being with us. We truly appreciate you. And see you all, everyone, next week. Have a great day. Have a great weekend. And thank you.
Thank you, Aaliyah, so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for your questions, and I hope to see you next time.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.